The Plague of Florence, the doctor who defied death. Imagine a city so consumed by death that its greatest masterpieces, works of art that defined a generation, were used as fuel for the funeral pyres. A city where the chime of the church bell became an hourly toll not of devotion, but of a soul lost. Florence, 1348. The jewel of the Renaissance was about to be turned to ash, and the seeds of the modern world would be sown in the scorched earth of its despair. If you love stories where history turns darker than fiction, make sure to subscribe. We've only just opened the first page of Florence's reckoning. The Black Death in Florence, the plague that changed everything. The City of Gold, the Year of Ruin. Florence, the spring of 1348, was a spectacle of impossible wealth and raw, pulsating life. The air thick with the scent of lilies and the pervasive odor of leather tanning from the Oltrarno district buzzed with an intoxicating energy. The city was a colossal, gilded merchant's ledger, its economy a complex tapestry woven from wool, banking, and global trade. The skyline was dominated by the still-rising Duomo, a monument to collective civic pride, and the fortified palaces of families like the Bardi, the Peruzzi, and the infamous Medici, whose burgeoning influence was already palpable. But beneath the frescoed ceilings and the marble facades, Florence was a tinderbox of social tension. The popolo grasso, the fat people, the wealthy merchants and bankers had consolidated power, their opulence a direct insult to the popolo minuto, the countless artisans and laborers who toiled in the shadow of their employers' grandeur. It was into this crucible of contradictory forces, unprecedented cultural flourishing, and deep-seated social inequity that the scourge arrived. Marco's secret chamber. Our story begins not with a corpse, but with a promise. Marco Bellini, 33, was a man whose hands were as skilled in dissection as they were in painting. Officially, he was a physician's apprentice, one of the last remaining students of the venerable Dr. Leone, whose medicinal texts gathered dust faster than his reputation faded. Unofficially, Marco was a radical, a true student of the human form, driven by a quiet, almost sacrilegious hunger for knowledge that the church frowned upon. He lived in a small rented room atop a bakery near the Ponte Vecchio, the perpetual smell of burnt crust, a strange comfort. Marco was unlike the traditional Florentine medical men, who relied on the ancient theories of Galen, the four humors, the belief that illness was a divine or astrological imbalance. Marco trusted only what his own eyes and knife could tell him. In a hidden, stone-lined chamber beneath his room, accessible only by a trapdoor concealed under a rug, Marco performed his secret, forbidden work. It was here, by the flickering light of tallow candles, that he dissected the bodies of the unclaimed dead, charting the inner landscape of man. His most recent subject, a vagrant fished from the Arno a week prior, had shown none of the typical signs of disease. A quick drowning, mercifully clean. The work was slow, painstaking, and utterly heretical. Then, in mid-March, a different kind of subject was brought to the local pauper's graveyard, a weaver from the Santa Croce district, dead within 3 days of a sudden, mysterious fever. Marco, through a network of carefully bribed gravediggers, managed to secure the body under the cloak of a midnight storm. In his secret chamber, Marco began the gruesome work. The black swellings. The weaver's body was a terrifying canvas. Marco had read the fearful, vague dispatches from the Venetian ports, whispers of a pestilence from the east, a great mortality spreading like wildfire across Sicily and the coastal towns, but nothing prepared him for the physical reality. The first incision revealed the truth. In the groin and armpits. The mayor's denial. Marco knew the city must be warned. He abandoned his solitude and rushed through the crowded streets towards the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of Florentine government. He found Mayor Lorenzo Salviati in his office, a man whose chief concern had, until this moment, been the new taxation laws and the ongoing quarrel with the Pisan merchants. Salviati was fat, complacent, and dressed in the luxurious deep red velvet that signified his rank. "Signor Mayor," Marco gasped, dropping his blood-stained bag on the polished stone floor. "It has arrived. The great mortality. It is here." Salviati, a man who saw everything through the lens of commerce and political expedience, merely frowned. "And what precisely, young Marco, is it? A new tax on wool? Another riot among the dye workers?" Marco laid out a schematic drawing, a diagram of the weaver's internal affliction, meticulously drawn. He explained the symptoms, the buboes, the swiftness of death, the incredible contagion. "It is not a matter of humor, signor. It is something that passes from man to man, from the sick to the healthy. We must quarantine the afflicted. We must cleanse the streets. We must—" Salviati cut him off with a dismissive wave of a jeweled hand. "Nonsense! I have received reports from the Ufficiali di Sanità, the health officers. They blame the stench from the tanneries, the damp air of the spring, perhaps even a minor astrological confluence. They are cleansing the streets, using vinegar and fire. The problem is isolated, limited to the poorer districts where sanitation is, shall we say, naturally lacking." He leaned forward, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Do you know what panic does to the Bardi Bank, Marco? Do you know what quarantine does to the flow of silk and spice from the East? It is ruinous. We will have no panic. We will have piety. Processions will be ordered. More masses will be sung. God will favor Florence, the city of his grace." Marco stared at the mayor's gilded complacency, the horrifying realization dawning on him. The greatest enemy of Florence would not be the plague itself, but the hubris of its leaders. "Signor," Marco pleaded, "the infection is spread by the very air they breathe, by the touch of a garment. Processions will not save them. They will be funeral marches. The sheer number of dead will soon overwhelm the city's ability to bury them." Salviati rose, signaling the end of the meeting. "Your zeal, Marco, is admirable, if a tad vulgar. Go now. Study your Galen. The state will manage the crisis with good sense and the power of prayer. And remember, the true plague is not what kills the body, but what stops the flow of money." Marco left the palazzo, the grand edifice now seeming like a vast, beautiful tomb. He had been rejected by the system, his empirical knowledge scorned for comfortable tradition. The Serpent was in the Arno, and the gates to the city's heart were wide open. The art of despair. As the official denial reigned, the sickness grew. It crept out of the poor neighborhoods and into the workshops, the markets, and the most magnificent palaces. By late April, the grim statistics could no longer be dismissed. A small merchant street near the Mercato Nuovo, 20 houses, lost 15 families entire in 4 days. The cultural elite, the patrons of the arts, were the next to fall. Piero di Donato, a young, brilliant sculptor, whose chisel was already being compared to that of the great masters, was in the midst of carving a colossal marble Pieta for the church of Santa Maria Novella. Marco had known Piero since childhood. They had often debated the structure of the body, Piero seeking muscular perfection, Marco seeking anatomical truth. Marco found Piero feverish, racked with pain, the dreadful buboes already visible in his neck. The sculptor's studio, usually a place of joyous, creative chaos, was now a silent, echoing chamber. "Marco," Piero whispered, his eyes glazed with a fear more profound than death, It is the hand of God, a punishment for our vanitas, our pride, the beauty we chased, the gold we coveted." Marco ignored the theological despair, his mind racing for a practical solution. He tried the only measures he knew, lancing a buboes, a terrible, agonizing procedure, and applying salves of herbs, vinegar, and ground garlic. All to no avail. The fever intensified, turning Piero's mind into a furnace of delirium. In his final lucid moments, Piero gripped Marco's hand. "The Pietà, Marco. Do not let it stand for the living. It is a monument to the dead. The face of Mary. It is not grief. It is abandonment. Tell them, we all are abandoned." Piero died that night, choking on his own blood. The tragedy was not merely the loss of a life, but the obliteration of potential. The most brilliant minds, the most skilled hands were being swept away indiscriminately. The very soul of Florence, its devotion to beauty and human potential, was being extinguished. Marco took up a hammer and smashed the head of the unfinished Pietà into jagged shards, ensuring it could never be repurposed. It was an act of terrible, necessary respect, a refusal to let his friend's final, despairing work be celebrated by a city he felt was beyond salvation. The funeral pyres and the bikini. As May bled into June, the sheer volume of the dead broke the city's civic structure entirely. The churches were piled high with corpses. The undertakers, the bikini, became the true masters of Florence. They were the poorest, the most desperate, often recruited from the beggar class, identifiable by their dark, waxed tunics and the long poles they used to prod and move the bodies, avoiding contact. Their fees became astronomical. A proper burial, once a sacred duty, was a luxury for the quickly vanishing elite. The bikini grew obscenely wealthy, their eyes as cold and dead as the bodies they handled. They looted the dead, stripped the abandoned houses, and celebrated their morbid fortune with drunken, cynical revels in the empty streets. The graveyards filled and overflowed. Mass graves had to be dug outside the city walls, vast, horrific pits known as fossi comuni. Boccaccio described the scene vividly. The bodies, often 2 or 3 layers deep, unceremoniously dumped, covered with a thin layer of earth, only to be reopened hours later for the next installment of the dead. Marco witnessed a scene that would haunt him forever. A small boy, no older than 7, staggering toward a mass grave, dragging his mother's body wrapped in a sheet. He pleaded with a burly bacchino to take her, offering the man a single tarnished silver coin, all he had left. The bacchino laughed, spat on the coin, and kicked the body, telling the boy to find a hole and get to work. Driven by a white-hot rage, Marco intervened. He paid the bacchino with the last of his own savings, and with his own hands lowered the woman into the earth. The boy, numb with shock, looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "What is your name, son?" Marco asked. "Sandro," the boy whispered. "Sandro," Marco said, placing a cross of 2 sticks over the makeshift grave. "You will stay with me now. We have work to do." The new order of despair. The plague did not just kill, it inverted reality. Brother abandoned brother, wife abandoned husband, parents refused to tend their own children. The traditional social bonds, the bedrock of Florentine society, dissolved instantly in the face of absolute terror. 2 distinct extreme philosophies of survival emerged, as noted by the chroniclers. The ascetics of fear, a group who believed the plague was God's righteous punishment, They retreated into isolation, living meagerly on coarse bread and water, praying incessantly, and avoiding all contact, convinced that purity and piety would shield them from the divine wrath. Marco respected their isolation, but scorned their passivity. The hedonists of doom, the opposite extreme, those who decided that since death was inevitable, the only sane response was unbridled, immediate pleasure. They broke into abandoned villas, feasting on the finest wines and foods, singing bawdy songs and indulging every carnal desire, convinced that temperance and moderation were pointless. They lived and died in a blaze of nihilistic luxury, becoming walking vectors of the disease they scorned. Marco, with the young boy Sandro now silently trailing him, formed a third way, the pragmatists of action. He established a small, makeshift infirmary in the abandoned workshop of a deceased leather merchant. His supplies were meager: vinegar for cleaning, herbs for simple fever reduction, and most importantly, his own courage. He wore a simple waxed cotton mask soaked in strong vinegar, a primitive, half-understood attempt at filtering the miasma, the poisonous air he believed carried the disease. He did not cure, no one did, but he provided care. He gave the dying a clean bed, a drink of fresh water, and a kind word. In a city where the dead were treated like garbage, this was a revolutionary act. Marco's greatest weapon was his refusal to deny reality. He instructed the few brave souls who joined him, mostly widows with nothing left to lose, and a handful of disillusioned friars, in rudimentary infection control. "Burn everything," he commanded. "Burn the bedding, burn the clothes. Do not touch the body, do not touch the buboes. And when they die, wrap them tight and do not delay." The plague was a great leveler, but Marco's efforts focused on the remnants of the popolo minuto. The rich had fled, their beautiful villas becoming ghost houses, their jewels and gold abandoned on the very tables they had dined upon. The true tragedy was unfolding among the poor who could not escape: the collapse of order. By mid-June, Florence was no longer a city of laws, but a chaotic, grotesque parody of itself. Mayor Salviati's policy of piety and denial had catastrophic consequences. The public processions, instead of appeasing God, became mobile contagion vectors, spreading the disease with lethal efficiency through tightly packed crowds. The bureaucracy crumbled first. Notaries, essential for commerce and the drawing up of wills, died at an alarming rate. When a man succumbed to the plague, his property was instantly up for grabs. Lawyers, priests, and physicians, the pillars of civic order, simply fled, abandoning their posts, their patients, and their parishioners. Matteo Villani, a great chronicler of the time, noted with horror how the very wealthy, those who had preached morality and order, were the first to commit acts of monstrous selfishness. They locked their gates, fired their servants, and retreated to their walled country villas, attempting to buy their way out of God's wrath. In the power vacuum, a terrifying, temporary freedom emerged. With no police, no courts, and no fear of long-term consequence, the city became a playground for the reckless. Criminals openly pillaged the palaces abandoned by the elite. Artisans, suddenly free from their masters and protected by the anonymity of chaos, dressed themselves in the fine silks of the dead and drank the vintage wine left behind. The social order of medieval Florence, a rigid hierarchy held together by laws and fear of eternal damnation, was dissolving into a fleeting, lawless carnival of despair. The widow and the vultures. Marco's makeshift infirmary became a small beacon in the spreading darkness, mostly thanks to the quiet strength of Contessina di Rinaldi, a woman in her late 40s. Contessina was a merchant's widow, accustomed to managing a household with iron will. When her husband and 2 children died within a week, she refused to flee or descend into madness. Instead, she took her grief and forged it into a brutal, practical energy. "Grief is a luxury for the living," she told Marco, her face gaunt, but her eyes utterly steady. "Our duty is to the dying and to those who may yet survive." Contessina's expertise was organization. She took control of the food and water supply, haggling with the terrified farmers who would only come as far as the city gates, demanding absurd prices. She protected their small cache of supplies from the looting gangs, wielding a rusty meat cleaver with startling competence. One afternoon, a wealthy young man, Silvio, burst into the infirmary, reeking of expensive wine and panic. He was a notorious hedonist from the Santa Croce district who had been partying in an abandoned palace. His arm was wrapped in a scarlet-stained silk scarf. He had a fresh bubo the size of a lemon. "You must save me!" he shrieked, throwing a heavy purse of gold florins onto a cot. "I am wealthy! I can pay! No expense spared! Use your potions!" Contessina stepped forward, her shadow falling over the gold. "The money is useless here, Silvio. We accept no payment. You have chosen your path. We will give you water and a clean place to lie. That is all we can do." Marco, exhausted and weary, attempted to clean the wound. "Why did you wait so long, Silvio? You knew the risk." He began to weep, his bravado gone. "We were having fun, Marco, such glorious fun. We thought the wine would cleanse us, that the sheer joy would repel it. We danced the danse macabre, we mocked death. But now I feel the fire." He died hours later, raving mad, the gold purse still lying on the cot. Contessina scooped up the florins. "Burn them," Marco instructed, shaking his head. "No," Contessina replied, her voice cold. "Gold does not carry the sickness, but it buys the only thing that matters now, wood for the pyre." She had transformed from a gentle widow into a terrifyingly efficient pragmatist, seeing the wealth of the dead only as the currency needed to give the other dead a final dignity.
The Serpent and the Lamb. Marco's daily rounds through the city were a descent into Hieronymus Bosch's hellscape. The air was a heavy, sweet-sour blend of rotting bodies, cheap wine, and the acrid smoke from the increasing number of public pyres. One morning, while passing the Palazzo Vecchio, Marco saw a spectacle that crystallized the tragedy of Florence. A renowned painter, Filippo Brunetti, known for his vibrant, joyous religious frescoes, had recently died. His final masterpiece, a massive panel painting of the Adoration of the Magi, stood unfinished in his ransacked studio. The Bacchini, unable to find enough firewood, the price of wood had become prohibitive, had solved the problem with stunning sacrilege. They had dragged Brunetti's colossal painting into the piazza. Using axes, they were chopping the gilded, hand-painted wood panel into pieces. The serene faces of the Virgin and the Magi were being splintered into kindling. Marco stopped, transfixed. It was the absolute, final violation of the Florentine spirit. A city that measured its worth by its beauty and devotion to art was now consuming its own treasures to dispose of its dead. The aesthetic soul of the Renaissance was being immolated on the pyres of pragmatism. Nearby, a small, frightened girl was holding a white lamb. She was crying, believing the lamb was safe from the plague. A gaunt, crazed friar, driven by madness by the death around him, screamed, "The Lord demands a sacrifice. The Lamb of God will save us." Before Marco could move, the friar snatched the lamb and, in a frenzied attempt at atonement, brutally slit its throat, splashing its blood across the stone pavement, believing the sacrifice would purge the city. The sight, the sacrilege of art, and the madness of piety broke something in Marco. He realized the enemy was not just the bacteria, it was the total loss of reason, the absolute descent into superstition and self-destruction. The prophecy of Sandro. The young boy, Sandro, Marco's silent shadow, had retreated entirely into a shell. He rarely spoke, but his eyes missed nothing. He was the perfect, traumatized witness. One scorching afternoon in July, when the plague was at its terrifying zenith, killing 3 out of every 5 infected people and sometimes thousands a day, Marco and Contessina collapsed on the steps of a deserted church. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the distant rhythmic clang of the Bacchini's cart bells. Sandro walked up to Marco, his small hands clutching a piece of charcoal and a broken tile. He knelt on the ground and began to draw. He did not draw the buboes or the dying. He drew the sky. His drawing was a vision, a sun, black at the center, surrounded by 9 smaller circles, all collapsing in on each other. It was a terrifying, abstract depiction of the chaos, yet drawn with the frightening precision of a child who had seen the cosmic pattern of disaster. "What is this, Sandro?" Marco asked, gently. Sandro pointed a bony finger at the drawing. His voice was a dry rasp, used for the first time in weeks. "The stars are broken. They told the priests it was their fault, but it is not their fault. It is the fault of the mice." He was referring to the astrological theories pushed by the doctors of the Paris University, who had declared the plague was caused by a malignant alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345. Sandro, having lived in the streets, knew the true vector. He had seen the dead rats, smelt the rot, and understood the connection between filth, vermin, and the creeping disease better than any scholar. Marco was struck dumb. The child, the lowest of the popolo minuto, had reached an empirical scientific conclusion that the most learned men of Europe had missed simply by observing the world around him. His childhood innocence had been traded for a terrifying, brutal insight. Marco gently touched the drawing. "You are right, Sandro. The stars are not broken. The chain of life is broken." He took the charcoal from the boy, and on the back side of the tile drew his own diagram, a simple sketch of the human body, with lines connecting the flea, the rat, and the man. It was the first nascent hypothesis of germ theory, drawn on a piece of trash in the heat of a plague-ridden city. The death of Florence was forcing the birth of empirical reason. The final betrayal. As July turned to August, the number of deaths began, slowly, to drop. The plague was not defeated, it was simply running out of hosts. The city's population was halved, perhaps even 2/3 gone. The silence became the most deafening sound of all. Marco, Contessina, and Sandro were among the few survivors. They were physically depleted, but spiritually hardened. They had performed their final gruesome duty, burying their own fallen comrades from the infirmary. Marco walked to his old master, Dr. Leon's house. The old man was alive, having walled himself into his library with 6 months' supply of food and wine, reading Galen and occasionally burning incense. Marco presented his notes, his anatomical sketches, and Sandro's crude but profound insight. "Master," Marco said, his voice husky from disuse, "we must write a new account. The humors are dead. The stars are irrelevant. It is a contagion spread by filth and contact. We must reform the city, build new sanitation, banish the tanneries, and establish quarantines." Dr. Leon,
thin and pale, but physically untouched, looked at the papers. He did not read the anatomical notes. He looked at the drawing of the buboes and the diagram of the rat. Then the old man slowly gathered the pages, tearing them one by one. "Madness, Marco! Utter madness!" Leon hissed, his fear turning to venom. "You speak of a new world, a new science. You blame the very creatures of God? Are you accusing the heavens of being mistaken?" He threw the scraps into the fire. "The Black Death was a divine scourge for our sins. That is the truth the Church and the Signoria will demand. It is the only truth that allows us to rebuild order. If we say it was rats and filth, we undermine the authority of the Church, the wisdom of the ancients, and the very foundation of medicine. We will not have chaos in our knowledge. You will return to Galen, Marco. You will say what is safe and familiar, or you will be declared a heretic, a dangerous radical." It was the ultimate tragic betrayal. The survivor of the plague, who had seen the future, was silenced by the survivor of the past, who wished to resurrect the comforting lie. The ultimate tragic end. Marco stared at the flames consuming his work, the brutal, precious evidence of a truth bought at the cost of half a continent. His anger was a frozen thing, cold and absolute. He understood then the depth of the tragedy. The Black Death did not just kill bodies, it destroyed the opportunity for a fundamental progressive change in human thought. The weight of tradition and the fear of losing control were stronger than the lesson of the grave. Marco turned and left the house, not as a physician, but as a ghost. He was one of the last, the most exposed. The plague, in its final cruel twist, reserved a special kind of terror for those who thought they had escaped. A few days later, while working to salvage food from the abandoned streets, Contessina collapsed. She had nursed hundreds, cleaned their infected clothes and buried them. She had faced down the Bellini and the looters. She had survived through sheer force of will, but she could not escape the final contact. Marco and Sandro sat beside her cot, powerless. She had fever, and then the telltale, terrifying purple spots began to bloom across her neck, the sign of pneumonic plague, the swift killer. "Marco," she whispered, her lungs failing. "The gold. I never told you where I hid Silvio's gold. It is under the broken floorboard in the vestry of Santa Maria Novella. Use it. Build the sanitation. Build the new city." She reached out a hand for Sandro, her surrogate son, but before the boy could take it, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, she gasped once, a rattling sound that echoed in the vast, silent room, and then was gone. Marco, who had remained stoic through 1,000 deaths, broke. He had lost his city, his master, his belief in humanity, and now the one person who had shared his truth. He took Contessina's rigid hand. Sandro, the boy who understood the plague better than any scholar, watched Marco. He reached out and gently placed the charcoal-drawn tile, the serpent and the lamb, on Contessina's still chest. Marco looked at the boy and realized that the greatest terror was not dying, but living to remember. The final, horrifying truth: Contessina had died for nothing. Her wisdom, her courage, and her secret fortune were now locked away, buried in a secret place in a ruined, silent church, unreachable to the one man left to carry her dream. Marco arose, his face expressionless, his eyes filled with the terrible, cold knowledge of absolute defeat. He took Sandro by the hand and walked out into the skeletal silence of Florence, the jewel city of the world, now nothing more than a vast, beautiful graveyard. The plague was over, but the tragedy of the future was just beginning. The new world would have to wait. The dawn of the shadowed age, the stillness and the rebirth. The Black Death's first, most ferocious wave subsided in Florence by late August 1348. The fever left the city not with a bang, but with a profound, terrifying silence. Over 50% of the city's population, estimated at over 50,000 souls, had vanished. The stench began to fade, replaced by the scent of dust and the bitter smell of unburned wood. The surviving city was unrecognizable. The old social order was broken. The economy was in ruins. Yet an unnerving kind of rebirth began almost immediately, driven by two brutal realities: a monumental labor shortage and an unprecedented redistribution of wealth. The working classes, the popolo minuto, and the surviving peasants now held the power. With so few hands to mill the wool, till the fields, or lay the stone, wages for labor soared to astronomical levels. A simple laborer could now demand more money in a day than he had previously earned in a week. This economic upheaval led to the rise of the gente nueva, the new people. These were the survivors who, by grim chance or cynical exploitation, had inherited fortunes or capitalized on the labor shortage. They were not the old aristocratic families. They were new merchants, lesser guildsmen, and the brutally efficient bikini who had survived, often through sheer lack of conscience. They were raw, unsophisticated, and desperately eager to prove their new status. The shadow of art, the triumph of the macabre. The spiritual and cultural response to the tragedy was immediate and profound, a direct repudiation of the joyful humanism that had been blossoming before the plague. The art of Florence darkened, obsessed now with mortality, memento mori, and divine judgment. Marco saw this shift firsthand when he and Sandro ventured into the desolate streets. The surviving artists, shaken to their core, abandoned the vibrant, naturalistic style of the early Renaissance. They adopted a severe, abstract, and deeply conservative style, designed not to celebrate man, but to warn him. In the frescoes of the surviving churches, Marco witnessed the new theology of terror. The triumph of death. Massive, horrifying frescoes appeared, depicting death as a winged skeletal crone or a monstrous cavalier, mercilessly mowing down popes, emperors, and peasants alike. It was a terrifying equalizer, stripping away the hierarchy of the living. The dance macabre. Skeletons danced with the living. A bride, a bishop, a plowman, a grotesque, vivid reminder that death waited for everyone, regardless of rank or piety. The artistic patronage of the gente nueva fueled this macabre turn. The new rich, fearful of the death that had spared them, and desperate to buy forgiveness, poured their inherited wealth not into joyful civic projects, but into commissions for funerary art and altarpieces dedicated to plague saints like Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, hoping to ward off the next inevitable wave. They sought protection, not beauty. The magnificent expansion of the Duomo was halted, its soaring ambition a casualty of death and despair. The work of Brunelleschi and his successors would be delayed for decades. Florence's artistic engine was not stopped. It was violently rerouted into a psychological landscape of fear and guilt.
The quest for the vestry gold. Marco and Sandro, now operating on the frayed edges of the new Florentine society, were driven by a singular purpose: Contessina's gold. Marco knew the secret fortune. Silvio's final, terrible price represented the only chance to implement the changes necessary for the city's survival: sanitation, reform, and a new hospital. They had to find the vestry in the church of Santa Maria Novella. The basilica, one of Florence's grandest, was a desolate fortress. Most of the friars had died or fled. Marco and Sandro crept in one starless night, armed with a lantern and a crowbar. The air inside was stale and heavy, charged with the phantom whispers of countless funeral rites. They found the vestry, a small dark room adjacent to the main altar. Marco recalled Contessina's final desperate whisper, "Under the broken floorboard." They worked in nervous silence, the screech of the crowbar against the marble floor echoing unnervingly in the vast, empty church. Finally, Marco managed to pry up a loose section of the marble near a decaying wooden cabinet. There it was, a velvet pouch, heavy with the weight of gold florins, the currency of Silvio's debauchery and Contessina's desperate hope. Marco held the pouch, its contents clinking softly. This gold could change everything. The final, tragic irony. But as they stood to leave, the silence was shattered by the creak of the vestry door swinging open. Standing in the doorway, framed by the pale moonlight filtering from the central nave, was a figure Marco recognized immediately. Donato, the burliest and most cynical of the surviving bikini. Donato, who now dressed in gaudy new silks and wore a ridiculously oversized golden chain. Donato, who had abandoned the boy Sandro's mother in the street. "Well, well," Donato sneered, his voice oily. "Looks like the saintly doctor found a new cure for poverty." He had been watching them. The bikini, having once been the city's scavengers, were now its most organized criminal element, constantly alert for abandoned wealth. Marco instinctively pushed Sandro behind him. "This is not for you, Donato. This is for the city's poor, for sanitation, for the next sickness." Donato laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "The next sickness will line my pockets even further. The only thing the city needs is gold, and the only man who deserves it is the one strong enough to keep it. Give it to me, physician." A violent struggle ensued. Donato, heavy and powerful from months of unchallenged street dominance, lunged for the pouch. Marco, though weakened by weeks of meager food and constant work, fought with the savage desperation of a man protecting his final hope. The crowbar became a weapon. Marco struck Donato, grazing his head. The bikino roared, grabbing Marco and slamming him against the cabinet. The gold pouch slipped from Marco's grasp, scattering bright florins across the marble floor. It was then that Sandro moved. The silent boy, the living embodiment of the plague's devastation, grabbed the crowbar. He did not cry out or hesitate. He swung the heavy iron rod with all his strength, connecting with a sickening crack against the back of Donato's skull. Donato collapsed instantly, a heavy, dead weight on the cold floor, his head resting in a pool of his own rapidly spreading blood. Marco stared, horrified at the bikini's corpse, then at Sandro, who dropped the crowbar with a clatter and stared wide-eyed at his hands. The silent child of the plague had just committed murder.
Marco knew the new, fragile order could not tolerate this. A bikini's death, especially one as wealthy and feared as Donato, would be investigated, not for justice, but for the location of his money. They were trapped.
The tragic conclusion. Marco swiftly gathered the gold, his hands shaking. He looked at the boy, Sandro, whose innocence had been crushed, whose hands were now stained with blood. Marco had hoped to save the city. Instead, he had turned a child into a killer. Marco knew he could not stay. If caught, Sandro would be hanged. If he used the gold to establish his revolutionary reforms, the authorities, Dr. Leone and the complacent Signoria, would reject the ideas, condemn his methods, and eventually execute him for the murder of Donato and the theft of the gold, which, by the new laws, now belonged to the state. He had the gold, the knowledge, and the will, but he had lost his ability to act. The truth of the plague was too radical, too challenging to the established power structure to be accepted. The ultimate, shocking tragedy. Marco made his final, most tragic decision. He could not use the gold in Florence. He could not stay. His scientific truth would be buried, and his life would be forfeited. He led Sandro out of the city gates and across the dark, silent Tuscan countryside, fleeing south toward the coast. He carried the heavy pouch of gold, the final shimmering symbol of hope and change, not to the city's treasury, but with him into exile. He would become a wandering man, a ghost carrying the only true cure for the plague that had been ignored. They reached the port of Naples. Marco bought passage on a ship heading east, away from the collapsing European civilization. He would take his empirical knowledge, his radical anatomical notes, and his blood-stained gold to the waiting world of the Ottoman Empire, the very east from which the plague had sprung, seeking a culture more open to science, less shackled by the dogmas of Galen and the Pope. But the plague was not done with Marco. During the journey, the terror that had shadowed Marco's life claimed its final victim, Sandro, the child who had borne witness to the truth of the plague, succumbed not to the buboes, but to the deep, pneumonic form of the disease, a cold, sudden fever that consumed his lungs in a single night. Marco buried the boy on a lonely, wind-swept beach, the last person to carry the burden of the Florentine truth. He stood by the water's edge, the sack of gold in his hands. It was useless now. The knowledge was contained only in his mind, and the means to implement it, the gold, was meaningless without a city and a purpose. In a final, profound act of despair, Marco walked to the edge of the turbulent Mediterranean Sea. He opened the velvet pouch and watched the brilliant gold florins, the blood money, the dream money, the ransom for a new world, sink into the dark, indifferent waters. He had the truth, but the plague had stolen his city, his comrades, his pupil, and finally his hope. The only thing left to him was the cold, desolate knowledge that the Black Death had changed everything, but mankind, in its pride, fear, and intellectual paralysis, had learned nothing. Marco Bellini vanished into the East, a haunted pioneer, the living proof that sometimes the greatest tragedies are not the deaths that happen, but the scientific and moral revolutions that are killed before they can ever truly begin. Florence would rebuild, but it would take another century, the true Renaissance, to rediscover the truths that Marco Bellini had paid for with his soul in the plague year of 1348.